Magnolia is the third feature-length film by director Paul Thomas Anderson. The ambitious 3-hour film was received positively overall and won some awards, but it also got plenty of mixed reviews. Some criticize the film as being too overstuffed, too melodramatic, and call the third act, Reign of Frogs, a self-indulgent cop-out. There's a sense that Anderson got lost in the sauce. In this exchange, film critic Joyce Kulhauek tells Roger Ebert that the film is a mess. She thought that the film, quote, would have come together in some unexpected synergistic way, and there would have been some sort of epiphany at the end. These stories don't come together, and we're led to think that they will. She goes on to say that this climax of biblical proportions should be a transforming event. She complains that it makes no sense. In this clip, film critic Joel Siegel tells Ebert, just when you're wondering how writer-director Paul Thomas Anderson can weave all these stories together, you realize he can't. Ebert defended the film and placed it on his best films of 1999 list. While I've always considered Magnolia to be an impressive film and Anderson to be an obvious master of his craft, I have to admit that over the years I've probably agreed with these critiques, at least to some extent. Hell, based on comments that he has made in recent years, I think Anderson himself agrees in a way. I rewatched Magnolia last month, prompted by the suggestion of a viewer. My opinion was pretty much the same as it had been when I first saw the film. But earlier this week, apropos of nothing, it occurred to me that there had been something I missed. There are many themes in Magnolia, and several are right on the surface at the forefront. Relationships between parents and their children, dark family secrets, cheating spouses, confrontation with death, running away from the past, the struggle to reconcile with the past, and the weight of regret. But it occurred to me that there's an interpretation of Magnolia, a particular lens we can look at it through, which serves to tie the whole thing together in that unexpected synergistic way some critics wanted back in '99. Magnolia can be understood as a deeply religious film, a film about God's grace, divine grace, delivered through messengers, helpers, and more direct intervention. When looking at it this way, I realize that the film is both loud and obvious about it, and at the same time somehow obfuscates it. Maybe it's just me, but this way of looking at the film had never occurred to me before. The film is so slick, so thick with emotion, and so packed with memorable, juicy movie moments that I think the spiritual religious angle gets overlooked. We miss the forest for the trees. After listening to many of Anderson's interviews over the years, I've noticed he has a tendency to go with the flow, to not knock down an interviewer's interpretation of his work. In an interview with Charlie Rose, Anderson was coy about what the film was about. He said it was hard to describe, and none of those working on the film could quite figure it out. Rose kept trying to get a clearer answer, and Anderson offers that the film is about parents and their children, about how a child grows up and how that relationship affects who you are. Rose offers that the film might be about American angst. Anderson says that'd be pretty good, and quickly changes the subject. Anderson ultimately says the entire film was about him. He put it all out on the page. Many years later, he told Marc Maron that Magnolia is, quote, about my dad. I just lost my dad and wrote a movie. Anderson describes the film as an open wound. He was so shocked by the news of his father's illness. Anderson had the thought, it's as if you told me it was raining frogs. Creative screenwriting quotes him as saying he was going through a weird personal time, and that Anderson started to understand why people turn to religion in times of trouble, and maybe my form of finding religion was reading about rains of frogs and realizing that makes sense to me somehow. As covered in several of my past videos, the word persona has its roots in an ancient word for theatrical mask. In Jungian psychology, the persona is the social mask, a character that we construct psychologically in order to navigate our way through society. As Jung wrote, the persona is a complicated system of relations between the individual consciousness and society, fittingly enough a kind of mask designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and, on the other, to conceal the true nature of the individual. But the thing is, personas cannot be perfectly maintained. Personas crack. In Magnolia, you have a large cast of characters struggling to maintain their personas against the reality of their lives. They are all in some way pretending to be someone they are not. In the film, we hear this line several times. The book says we may be through with the past, but the past ain't through with us. To my knowledge, it's not specified what book this is. Considering the biblical references to the Old Testament, one would assume the book is supposed to be the Bible. But, to my knowledge, this direct quote isn't found in the Bible. One way of looking at this quote, consistent with some of the overt themes in the story, is that it is a reference to the Book of Life. The Book of Life plays a role in the three Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It is a book where God keeps record of one's actions. These three religions are also commonly referred to as the people of the book, a term that originates from Islam. The book says we may be through with the past, but the past ain't through with us. Magnolia, I think, is playing around with concepts familiar to the people of the book. Professor Syed Hossein Nasr is an esteemed academic, philosopher, theologian, Islamic scholar, and Sufi mystic. It is through Nasr that I learned of the Islamic term, fitra. This is a concept that I think will be helpful for understanding what I'm getting at in this video. Nasr says, fitra means primordial nature in which God created us. It is primordial substance coming from the hands of God. All our imperfections are accretions through time, which gloss over and cover our fitra, though we still carry it within ourselves. But through the flow of time, gradually, this has been more and more covered up, and less accessible to normal human beings. It is by virtue of fitra we are able to go back to God and oneness. In the center of our being, we're always in relation with the divine. When thinking of the characters in Magnolia, I think the personas they present aren't just running away from the difficult worldly truths they face in their social and family dynamics. I think they've turned away from their deep inner selves, their fitra. The sense of unity found within this primordial inner being, the fitra, is interwoven with what we call divine love. I'm not referring to the cheap, manipulative status validation game-playing device that we call love in our modern world. This is what I call true love with a capital T. A primordial love that comes from deep within, and different traditions have their own way of referring to it. The philosophy, teachings, and poetry of Islamic Sufis like Rabia of Basra and Rumi point us to the idea that divine unity, Tawheed, is lived most fully through love. This primordial true love is a unity of bliss, consciousness, and understanding, what some forms of Hinduism call Sat Chit Ananda. This is the love that Martin Luther King Jr. wrote about when he said, "Love is the greatest force in the universe. It's the heartbeat of the moral cosmos. He who loves is a participant in the being of God." This love stems from one's inner primordial core. What some Christians refer to as the sacred or perpetual heart, or what Hindu bhakti traditions call the hridayam, the spiritual heart. Acting from one's inner core is considered by many religions to be divine or exceptional, even if we don't know it intellectually. Some forms of Judaism teach that there is only one single love in the world. This is the love of God for all His creations. This love penetrates every creature. It is called the life force. This primordial love is one's inner divine nature in action within our world. This is the love that some traditions of Buddhism call bodhicitta, loving kindness. It seems to me that each of these characters in Magnolia have created a persona to navigate the pain that comes from the absence of genuine loving kindness in their lives. Each has buried their fitra and has lost their way. Frank T.J. Mackey. He embodies the essence of what our personas are here to do in our society. A society based on status hierarchy, game-playing, and pleasure-seeking. What I commonly refer to on this channel as the status quo. Frank says, "In this game that we play, life, it's not what you hope for, it's not what you deserve, it's what you take." He's all about setting goals and marking time on the calendar. And he's all about winning. He has not only created a persona to navigate day-to-day society, as most of us do, he's created a full-fledged alter ego with a different name, a different backstory, and a different attitude. Despite all of this, and his incredible bravado, he is a broken child who was denied love and support from his father at the most difficult time in his life. Eventually, at his father Earl's side, in the throes of emotional release, Frank repeatedly says, "Don't go away," giving us a glimpse into the real human being. Officer Jim Curring. There's a lot in the film about him trying to be a good person, a good cop. Claudia sees him as such. The reality is, he has been living a lonely life since his divorce. He puts up a good front. He repeatedly says he's a happy cop, but he's considered a joke by his colleagues, and his only real company are the hosts on the Today morning show. He is lonely, has no one that loves him, and he has no one to love. He talks to himself a lot. He prays, and he talks to God a lot too. But when things go wrong, he drops the confident good man persona and gives voice to the despair lurking right underneath the surface. Jim exposes himself as a fearful, broken-hearted man who feels abandoned and lost. He asks God desperately, "Oh Lord, why is this happening to me?" And he begs, "God, please help me figure it out. I'm lost out here." Stanley Spector. Stanley is a boy that's been put on a public pedestal. He's actively growing into his persona as the local boy genius. In reality, he's a lonely child who spends his time outside of school, either studying alone or being exploited. He's being exploited by the adults in his life, including his dad, who is looking for fame. His father repeatedly says, "Love you" to him, but in a sort of lifeless manner. After one humiliation too many, Stanley finally cracks. The facade breaks down, and he gives everyone around him a real piece of his mind. Donnie Smith. Donnie was a boy that was put on a public pedestal and was exploited by his parents, who took his money. He's a sort of worst-case scenario for the track that Stanley is on. Due to years of abuse and bottling it all in, Donnie is somehow both narcissistic and meek. He's also deluded himself into trying to remake his persona, trying to become someone else by getting braces. Donnie thinks that getting corrective oral surgery will get the attention and admiration of his crush, Brad the bartender. Donnie is, quote, sick and in love, and he confuses the two. But despite being such a mess of a person, Donnie believes in, quote, real love, the kind of love that makes you feel intangible joy, and he cries out, "I have love." He proclaims, "My name is Donnie Smith, and I have lots of love to give. He's just never known where to put it." Jimmy Gator. Jimmy has spent his life maintaining the public persona of a beloved game show host and family man. Despite all the public adoration he receives, it doesn't amount to much because he's destroyed the real center of love in his life. He has betrayed his wife and has committed the horrible crime of abusing his daughter, who has walked out of their life. As illness and death advance upon him, Jimmy's mask cracks, and we see a clearer picture of who he really is. Rose Gator. Jimmy's wife has lied to herself about who Jimmy is and what he's done. She's put up a front as this supportive, loving wife, all the while having doubts about what Jimmy has done. She has not been there for her estranged daughter. In a way, she has abandoned her daughter. This charade all comes crashing down as she finally decides to question Jimmy. Claudia. Jimmy and Rose's daughter desperately tries to numb the pain of her father's abuse by destroying herself via a vicious drug habit and risky sexual encounters. She puts up the best front that she can when interacting with Jim. She asks, "Have you ever gone out with someone and just lie, question after question? Maybe you're trying to make yourself look cool or better than you are or whatever. Smart or cool or whatever, and you just not really lie. But maybe you just don't say everything." She eventually has to tap out of their date, worried Jim won't want to be with her once he finds out who she really is behind the facade she put up for him. She asks, "Now that I've met you, would you object to never seeing each other again?" Linda Partridge. Linda married Earl Partridge for money and status. She betrayed and used her husband. Now at the end of Earl's life, she struggles to come to terms with what she has done. She realizes that she truly loves Earl and hates herself for putting on a charade and betraying him. The false exploitative mask Linda had worn to grift Earl has come off, and she realizes that time has run out for her husband, with whom she could have shared a real, more meaningful love. The pain is so great that she attempts to end her life. And finally, we come to Earl Partridge, who on his deathbed tells us how he betrayed the love of his life, his first wife, as well as their son Jack. Jack is Frank. This monologue, which I've seen characterized as being primarily about regret, and no doubt it is about regret, but it also has a bigger point to make. The regret stems from what I think is the real point of this monologue. Earl says, "I loved her so, and she knew what I did, but the love was stronger than anything you can think of. The goddamn regret." Earl sobs, "Now I'll die and I'll tell you what. The biggest regret of my life. I let my love go. What did I do? Don't let anyone ever say to you, you shouldn't regret anything. Use that regret for anything any way you want." Earl then brings it home with what I think the real point of this monologue is. The real point is love, a word that he says 3 times with a desperate, aching heart. Illness and death have humbled this man, a man who had been so successful in the status quo. It took this much suffering for his persona to finally crack. This is how Nasr described suffering. Suffering comes from separation from who we really are, from the fitra, primordial nature. Going on to say that, quote, "We've created a situation where a human being seeks the needs the soul has so much outwardly as to make it impossible to even be with each other." The suffering these characters go through in the film comes from a separation from primordial nature, from primordial love. I think that speaks to the function of the sequence in which each of our main protagonists sing Amy Mann's Wise Up. My take on this sequence is that man is a stand-in for our shared soul, the anima mundi, which I've talked about previously on this channel. The soul, the anima mundi, is often described using feminine imagery or depicted outright as a woman. In the music video for Man's Save Me, shot by Anderson on set as part of the film's production schedule, Mann sits with each of the characters, further cementing my view that she's singing as their soul. Or if you want to describe it in more secular terms, their conscience. And I think the message for the characters is clear. Here are some notable lyrics in Wise Up. "It's not what you thought. When you first began it, you got what you want. Now you can hardly stand it, though. By now you know it's not going to stop. Till you wise up. No, it's not going to stop. So just give up." In the context of the film, she's asking for us to realize that all this outwardness, these worldly goals, all the striving for safety, love, and comfort in the outside world, only serves to make our lives worse. The suffering will not stop until you wise up and give up the game playing. Give up the false persona mask we're wearing and wise up. Richard Alpert, who was known as Ram Das for much of his life, often relayed something that his Hindu guru Neem Karoli Baba said, "Suffering brings me closer to God." And Nasr says, "The whole of religious life is to return to the real us." Suffering has to do with the loss of identity, and so suffering plays a special religious role. In Buddhism, the foundational first noble truth is the teaching that life is suffering, and the first step on the path towards freedom is the recognition of suffering within our lives and in the lives of others. Only then one can look at the root, the cause of suffering. Many Buddhist traditions teach that there is a fundamental ignorance about who we are, how we view this world, and our place within it. One of the most vivid examples of religious suffering is the image of Christ on the cross. One way of understanding Christianity is that this pivotal event, the crucifixion, isn't about suffering, which is often glorified. The crucifixion is about empathy. It's a story about how the divine intervened in the world out of care and compassion for its creation. Our word compassion literally comes from to suffer with in Latin, and our word empathy has roots in the Greek word pathos, also related to the concept of suffering. The crucifixion is a story about the divine's co-suffering within its own creation. The characters in Magnolia are at various stages within the archetypal story of a human life. Each is in a different stage of the recognition that their persona, their mask, has created separation from the fitra. This can be painful, but in my experience, as someone begins to really recognize the predicament they're in, that first noble truth of Buddhism, a sort of space opens up for divine intervention or grace in various forms to enter the picture and help us along the path. I think there are 3 types of divine interventions in Magnolia. The first of which are angels. Not these kinds of angels, but angels, in the traditional sense of the word, are messengers. The word angel comes from the word messenger. All 3 religions of the book refer to God's messengers, the angels. And in Islam, belief in angels is often presented as a key article of the faith. In Magnolia, I suspect we have at least one character that fulfills an angelic intermediary role. Dixon is a streetwise kid who raps enigmatically and prophetically, explaining that his song contains hidden meaning. It does seem to allude to plot details that he wouldn't know as just an ordinary character. But like many divine intermediaries, Dixon isn't understood or appreciated. Dixon intervenes in the life of Officer Jim by snatching his gun, setting up the breakdown of Jim's persona and his eventual transformation. Dixon also appears unexpectedly and saves Linda's life. The gun gets returned to Jim in a way which seems to cement Dixon's connection to some higher power. Dixon does not sing Amy Mann's Wise Up. Arguing with the antagonist bar patron Thurston, more on him later, Donnie exclaims, "No, it is not dangerous to confuse children with angels." Recalling that angel means messenger, Donnie's line brings to mind something I learned during a course I took on Greek philosophy with Raymond Moody, philosopher, psychiatrist, and physician, most widely known for his books about the afterlife. Moody mentioned that in the Greco-Roman period, at the Temple of Apis in Egypt, visitors would ask a question in one area in the temple, then sit and listen to children playing in a courtyard area. If one listened carefully, the divine would speak through the children's seemingly random chatter, as if they were little divine messengers, little angels. In this sense, I think that Stanley can be considered to be both a character struggling with forming a persona in this exploitative world, and still retaining enough purity to speak real truth by distilling the film's message on loving kindness into one straightforward, simple sentence: "Dad, you need to be nicer to me." And like with Dixon and Officer Jim, his dad takes a moment to listen, but he also dismisses the child. The second form of divine intervention is more overt: the rain of frogs. As far as I know, there are 2 passages from the biblical book of Exodus that are referenced in the film. The first is the well-known reference to Exodus 8:2, which speaks of God inflicting a plague of frogs. Anderson said that he wasn't aware that the rain of frogs could be understood as a reference to Exodus 8:2 until after he wrote the script. Anderson and his crew famously played up the film's connection to Exodus 8:2 by hiding references to the passage throughout the film. In a way, doing this makes the film even more ripe for interpretation as a religious, prophetic exclamation. Let's look at that passage itself. "If you refuse to let them go, I will send a plague of frogs on your whole country." If we look again within context, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Go to Pharaoh and say to him, this is what the Lord says, let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will send a plague of frogs on your whole country.'" Anderson said at the time, "If you want to reference the Bible, that's good. If you want to link it to something else, you can. There's a notion that you can judge a society's existence by the health of its frogs. There's something about a frog's health, the color of its skin, the texture, the wetness on its back. That's an indication of how we're treating ourselves as a society. So when you look around and see that all the frogs are dying or deformed, it's sort of a warning sign about how we're treating ourselves." The second mention of the book of Exodus comes from Donnie. Donnie mentions Exodus 25 when he says, "The sins of the father laid upon the children." In Exodus 25, God warns of multi-generational consequences for humanity's turning its back on God. Both of these references to Exodus involve divine warnings to a society that has turned its back on worship. Society gets infected by a plague and becomes cut off from the realm of true love. In many traditions around the world, worship of the divine is intrinsically connected to love and service of others, which is itself often considered a form of worship or honoring of the divine. Exodus 26, the verse after Donnie's quote, explains that God won't punish the sins of parents upon the children of those who love God and keep God's commandments. Instead, God will show love. The world of Magnolia, this world that has turned its back on true love, is flipped sideways by divine intervention. The rain of frogs can be understood to be a severe divine intervention that altered the lives of our characters in powerful ways, which we'll explore in the next section. But before we do that, let's look at the last kind of divine intervention that I think takes place in Magnolia. The last form of divine intervention, I think, may be the most important and the most subtle: fill. Phil doesn't have a redemption arc like the other main ensemble characters. He doesn't need one. Phil cares deeply. He is fully in tune with true love. He goes way beyond the scope of his job to help this family heal their wounds. He's the total opposite of Frank. He isn't there to take, he's there to give. He relays important messages, and he helps with the difficult task of helping an old man pass on to the other side. I've always been struck by Phil's crying. Not only is the performance by Philip Seymour Hoffman amazing, I get the sense that Phil isn't crying in the same way as the other characters. Most are crying out of suffering and anguish, often crying out from their own pain. It seems to me that Phil cries out of an authentic sense of empathy. He's not crying for himself, but out of pure compassion. Phil is a helper. Recently, I watched an interview given by Raymond Moody, in which he briefly references the idea that human beings are the fingertips of God. I think that is a good way to put it. The Gospel of John says, "I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me, and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing." Phil serves others in the way the religions of the book ask of their followers. As we put love into action, into service, we help strengthen our own inner connection to divine love. The tradition of bhakti within Hinduism views service and devotion as a form of worship. Loving service is described using the Sanskrit term seva. There is a humility and openness that comes with doing seva. And I think Phil is a great example of seva. By helping others, he acts as a fingertip of God. These interventions can all be understood as forms of grace. Grace, in Christian theology, is the spontaneous, unmerited gift of the divine favor in the salvation of sinners, and the divine influence operating in individuals for their regeneration and sanctification. I can't shake the idea that Magnolia is ultimately about God's grace expressing itself in order to aid in the salvation of these characters. Because of divine grace, Earl is able to silently look into his son's eyes, the last thing he sees in his life. Frank drops the facade after that deeply redemptive moment with his father. He shows a previously unseen sense of compassion by going to see Linda in the hospital, someone whose name he couldn't or wouldn't say just several hours before. Linda's life is saved. Donnie puts the stolen money back. Stanley looks up from his books, and we see bright, childlike wonder and innocence in his eyes for the first time. This experience brings him clarity and the confidence to speak truth to his father. Jimmy's suicide attempt is foiled, and a television set, a representation of the falseness of persona, is destroyed. Claudia drops her defenses without hesitation, allowing Rose to finally fulfill her role as a protective mom. Jim had spent the movie talking to God and imaginary interviewers, building his persona as a helper, as a good, happy cop, here to serve. But in reality, there was a clear desperation about it. The rain of frogs gave Jim the opportunity to genuinely help someone in need without any pretense. I think that during his encounter with Donnie, Jim becomes more like Phil. Jim will probably never be quite the same after what could be considered the one genuine miracle in the film. Jim's voiceover during the sequence where Donnie returns the stolen money sounds similar to his previous monologues on the surface, but if you consider what he's saying to us, the audience, it almost sounds like what Jim's God would say to us. Quote, "What most people don't see is just how hard it is to do the right thing. People think if I make a judgment call, that's judgment on them. But that's not what I do, and that's not what should be done. I have to take everything and play as it lays. Sometimes people need a little help, sometimes people need to be forgiven, and sometimes they need to go to jail, and that is a very tricky thing on my part, making that call. I mean, the law is the law, and heck if I'm gonna break it. You can forgive someone, well that's the tough part. What can we forgive? Tough part of the job." One ironic detail here is that Donnie's boss is named Solomon, the name of the Old Testament king known for his wisdom and discernment when settling disputes. And during this sequence with Donnie, Jim displays Solomon like wisdom and discernment at Solomon's place of business. Jim's transformation brings to mind works from the latter half of C.G. Jung's life, such as Answer to Job. In this work, Jung explored the biblical God through a psychological lens. It's interesting how Jung sees this God figure as going through a sort of transformation due to its interaction with its own creation, the world of manifested time and space. Early on, God rules like a parent from high above, with a sense of separation from creation. God allows Job to suffer greatly, watching this drama play out from afar, somewhat aloof and indifferent. Eventually, God becomes Christ, experiencing its creation from within the creation. And now, post-Christ, including our present era, God distributes itself through the Holy Spirit, acting as a living divine force throughout all of creation. Some interpret this force as the divine feminine Sophia. No longer does God need to be worshipped as other, as the parent above, like Abraham or the suffering Job had to worship, but instead worshipped as an experiential living reality within us. And I think it's certainly possible, although maybe I'm pushing it here, that when Anderson says that the film is about parents and their children, that theme extends to the big picture relationship between God and human beings. In the movie, we see several father-child relationships start with the father as a domineering figure, indifferent to his creation's suffering, like Yahweh and the helpless Job. This applies to Earl and Jack. It applies to Stanley and his father, to Donnie and his off-screen parents, and it applies to Claudia and her father. Interestingly, both her abuser and redeemer share the same name. After Grace enters their lives, the previously powerless children now have a newfound perspective. With Officer Jim, his relationship with God starts off with him pleading and begging, and ends with him speaking imbued with spirit. The newly transformed Jim delivers the final monologue of the film, but this time, it's barely audible to the audience. It's not for us, it's for Claudia. Claudia sits and listens, her drugs in full view. He tells her, "You listen to me now. You're a good person, a good, beautiful person, and I won't let you walk out on me. I won't let you say those things about how stupid you are and this and that. I won't stand for that. You want to be with me, then you be with me. You see?" Anderson said that he knew very early on that he wanted to end the film with that final shot of Claudia smiling into the camera. This is a redemptive moment for Claudia, using Christian terminology. This is the moment Claudia was saved. The closing song which buries Jim's speech is Amy Mann's "Save Me," the song from the music video I mentioned earlier. In that video, Mann starts off by singing to Claudia, who fits Mann's description of a girl who is in need of a tourniquet. In the chorus, Mann sings, "Come on and save me, if you could save me, from the ranks of the freaks who suspect they could never love anyone." Anderson told Creative Screenwriting magazine, "That sort of notion of being unlovable or being so effed up you can't understand how anyone could love you back was really important and really beautiful to me. It kind of made sense to me at that time in my life. I think Claudia just needed one moment of unconditional acceptance, appreciation, and love without her baggage playing a role." Ram Dass talked constantly for like 50 years about the love exuding from his guru, Neem Karoli Baba. Through various interactions he couldn't explain, Ram Dass concluded that his guru could read his mind, and he was deeply ashamed of his impure thoughts, but says he was transformed by the fact that his guru, quote, "knew everything, and he still loved me." He described it like this: "You are loved just for being who you are, just for existing. You don't have to do anything to earn it. Your shortcomings, your lack of self-esteem, physical perfection, or social and economic success, none of that matters. No one can take this love away from you, and it will always be here." Over time, Ram Dass came to understand that the love he felt emanating from his guru was a reflection of the love within his own spiritual heart. His guru was simply pointing the way inside. I'm of the opinion that this sort of love only comes from a divine source within. It is like a Wi-Fi signal that we log onto. This signal pumps out love like you can't believe. It's the purest thing you can imagine. What else can one ask for? According to the New York Times, Paul Thomas Anderson fought against the studio's marketing team who wanted to go with a different poster. He had this poster designed and won the battle. Anderson told Charlie Rose that he had the title Magnolia before crafting the story, and he had been in contemplation about why this particular title had stuck with him. Anderson also refers to looking into the work of Charles Fort, who recorded anomalous events including rains of frogs. Fort coined the term Magnolia, which Anderson describes as a mythical place above the firmament where stuff goes to hang out. Stanley can be seen reading a book by Charles Fort in the library, and Ricky Jay's narration at the beginning and end of the film are very much inspired by Fort's work. The way I see it, the title Magnolia not only refers to this mythical realm, which could easily be seen as a stand-in for the transcendent, but also to the temporal location within our space-time. Magnolia Boulevard in LA, located within Anderson's beloved San Fernando Valley. For example, the bar Donnie spends much of the movie in is located right on Magnolia Boulevard. I think the film sets up a dynamic regarding the relationship between a transcendent realm and the immanent local realm. But it's quite sly in how it does so, since on the surface, nothing that happens in the film can't be explained within our regular day-to-day secular view of how the world works. When thinking about the dynamic between immanent and transcendent, I always think of Sri Aurobindo, the remarkably accomplished Indian philosopher, poet, revolutionary, and yogi. Throughout his work, Aurobindo wrote about the nature of the transcendent and the immanent, and how the transcendent can be found within the immanent, within the world of causality, and within us. Aurobindo also wrote that flowers are the moment's representations of things that are in themselves eternal, and that, quote, all religion is a flower. Looking at this poster with all this in mind, it seems clearer to me why this image, either consciously or unconsciously, was important to Anderson. This image is a mandala, a significant religious symbol within numerous traditions. In some Eastern traditions, like Taoism, Hinduism, and Buddhism, flower symbolism is incredibly important. This imagery goes back to the ancient Egyptian religion, where the blue lotus was a central fixture. In the Magnolia poster, you find some of the film's key narratives and characters portrayed as petals within the flower, circling a central circular core. The central core is surrounded by disks or waves, bringing to mind cosmic imagery and a common New Agey idea of reverberations that resonate and ripple across an area. This image brings to my mind the concept of divine Leela, or divine play, within certain Hindu traditions. Leela is the cosmic play of the divine, which creates this earthly world. This world seems like it is full of multiplicity, but in reality, it is one consciousness that expresses itself within a multitude of forms. This one consciousness plays out countless narratives, gets lost in them, eventually rediscovering itself. Sri Aurobindo wrote the following poem on Leela. It starts with, in us is the thousandfold spirit who is one, an eternal thinker calm and great and wise, a seer whose eye is an all-regarding sun, a poet of the cosmic mysteries. I think Ricky Jay's narration in Magnolia is pointing us to the fact that there is something else going on with the narratives in this life. At the beginning of the film, he says, it is in the humble opinion of this narrator that this isn't just something that happened. This cannot be one of those things. This, please, cannot be that. And for what I would like to say, I can't. This was not just a matter of chance. These strange things happen all the time. Why would Ricky not be able to say more? The film explicitly points us to the fact that Ricky's character is a Freemason, a member of a secretive group who are considered by some to hold mysterious mystic secrets. In real life, Ricky Jay was a well-regarded sleight-of-hand artist and magician. It's pertinent to ask, what sleight of hand was he pulling in Anderson's film? Quick aside, I've seen some theorizing that this character, Thurston, is meant to be the devil. I agree to an extent. He reminds me of Lucifer's origin story as a fallen angel. Thurston speaks in riddles according to Donnie, and he plays the role of an antagonist who tries to buy the bartender's love with money. Interestingly, his name Thurston is the name of a famous magician who can be seen here in a poster with little devil messengers whispering into his ears. You can buy posters of Ricky Jay doing an homage to that very image. Perhaps Thurston is a little devil spreading a false message. Even though Phil is no sleight-of-hand magician or fallen angel, this selfless, caring servant seems to have gained some awareness that he's playing a role in some larger drama. He feels as if he was in a movie, which of course he is, and the actor that plays him is named Phil, in a role written for him. The cosmic narratives of life seem to have an ironic, wry sense of humor. This is the cosmic giggle that psychonaut lecturer Terence McKenna liked to talk about. It's what some traditions would call a trickster spirit at work in the manifested world. Ricky Jay tells us at the end of the film that there are stories of coincidence and chance and intersections and strange things told, and which is which, and who only knows. And we generally say, well, if that was in a movie, I wouldn't believe it. And it is in the humble opinion of this narrator that strange things happen all the time. And so it goes, and so it goes. And the book says, we may be through with the past, but the past ain't through with us. Here again there's a reference to the book. What is this book? The Gospel of John famously opens with, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Strange as it may sound, I hear that, and can't help but see it is encapsulated in this image. Tom Cheetham, writing about the work of Henry Corbin, says, "For the religions of the book, all of reality can be understood as the Word of God." There are some who view this very life of ours as the Word. Your life right now is the Word of the Divine, manifested into space-time reality. So in a sense, this existence is God's book. God's scripture is life itself. Recently, I heard someone ask the well-worn question, why is there something rather than nothing? The mystic religious answer often boils down to one word: love. In this excellent lecture by Cecilia Twinch, we hear how Christian visionary Julian of Norwich described reality after she experienced powerful revelations. She saw that God is in everything. She saw He is at the center of everything, and He does all that is done. She was taken beyond the realm of human action to see that in fact, God is the only actor, and that all His works are wholly good. Sin is behovely, but all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. For Julian, like T.S. Eliot, sees behind humankind's suffering the all-powerful movement of love. Who devised the torment? Love. Love is the unfamiliar name behind the hands. When someone accesses their inner fitra, the divine unity inside all of us, and then expresses that sense of unity out into the world of forms, the divine spirit, who is love itself, is able to find itself again in this world of multiplicity. Divine love finds itself again through love. Another way to put it is that, if one's fitra loves another fitra, it's actually just love, loving love. There is no one else and nothing else, just love. The world melts away into the bliss of oneness. The New York Times quoted Anderson as saying, "I consider Magnolia a kind of beautiful accident." He explains, "It gets me. I put my heart, every embarrassing thing that I wanted to say, in Magnolia. I was trying to say something with this film without actually screaming the message." Anderson says, "Although 3 hours may be something of a scream, I wanted to hold the note for a while." Author Peter Kingsley writes about what he calls the prophetic howl in his book Catafalque, inspired by Allen Ginsberg's classic poem, Howl. Underneath all the New Age platitudes being politely piled nowadays, a mile high above the centuries of Christian platitudes, the pulsing heart of religion is what it always has been, the howl. The prophets howl to knock down the cardboard of our reasoning, howl at the damage we can't help inflicting on ourselves and the world around us, howl to give a voice to the sadness and depressions of a whole culture that everyone else has been left either to suffer or exploit in silence. With this in mind, it's time to revisit Anderson's comment about frogs. There's a notion that you can judge a society's existence by the health of its frogs. There's something about a frog's health, the color of its skin, the texture, the wetness on its back. That's an indication of how we're treating ourselves as a society. So when you look around and see that all the frogs are dying or deformed, it's sort of a warning sign about how we're treating ourselves. I think we need to take a moment and consider how everyone we know in this modern world we've created for ourselves is struggling to maintain a facade, a mask, a persona. But the mask doesn't fit right, and it can't ever fit right. Who we are can be found in our fitra, our inner self, our soul, the spiritual heart. The root of all compassion and empathy is to, quote, suffer with, which doesn't mean sulk and roll around in misery, but rather to keep our eyes open to what's going on with each other. Be good to someone else, because in many ways, they are you, and you are them. While Officer Jim is presented as mostly humorously naive, his philosophy wins out in Magnolia. Jim says, "In this life and in this world, I want to do well and I want to help people. One time I can help someone, make a save, I correct a wrong, or right a situation, then I'm a happy cop. And as we move through this life, we should try to do good. Do good." Jim echoes Dr. King, who said, "If I can help somebody as I pass along, if I can cheer somebody with a word or song, if I can show somebody he's traveling wrong, then my living will not be in vain. I just want to be there in love and in justice and in truth and in commitment to others, so that we can make of this old world a new world." Roger Ebert passed away in 2013. His wife Chaz talked to Esquire magazine for an article on his passing. She said the following: "The one thing people might be surprised about, Roger said that he didn't know if he could believe in God. He had his doubts. But toward the end, something really interesting happened. That week before Roger passed away, I would see him and he would talk about having visited this other place. I thought he was hallucinating. I thought they were giving him too much medication. But the day before he passed away, he wrote me a note. This is all an elaborate hoax. I asked him, what's a hoax? And he was talking about this world, this place. He said it was all an illusion. I thought he was just confused. But he was not confused. He wasn't visiting heaven, not the way we think of heaven. He described it as a vastness that you can't even imagine. It was a place where the past, present, and future were happening all at once. It sounds to me like Ebert might have gotten a preview of the bigger motion picture, the one where, as Shakespeare put it, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. Thanks for watching.